And now it is my privilege and honor to introduce the 8th president of the University of Nebraska, the Honorable Ted Carter. Although President Carter began his term more than 2 years ago, now almost 3 years ago, this is the first opportunity that we as an association have had an opportunity to hear directly from him at one of our monthly meetings. Many of you are familiar with his impressive bio by now, I'm sure, so I'll just provide a brief introduction. President Carter served his country for nearly 40 years as an F-14 flight instructor, rising to commander, rear admiral, and vice admiral before leading the U.S. Naval War College. After that assignment, he was appointed superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy. And shortly after he had concluded that assignment, he was tapped to lead the University of Nebraska system. We are fortunate that someone who has spent decades training young men and women to be leaders is now at the helm of our university system. Please help me welcome President Carter. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And hey, good afternoon, everybody. Nice winter field day out there, sun shining. It's Nebraska, right? It's great to be with you here today. I'm going to spend a few minutes with you. I'm going to give you a little bit of an update of some things that have been going on, just kind of bring you up to speed, and then I'm going to have a chance to answer your questions. I'm going to be mobile. I'm going to be able to come to you, let you ask a question. So while I'm talking, think about something you want to ask me. There's nothing that's off the table today. You can ask me anything you want. The first thing I want to just say is thank you. Thank you for coming here today on a chilly day, supporting your university. You are the people that have helped build this university, and I want you to know I get that. You are in the world of people that I call influencers at the very top of my list. So it's been too long for me to be able to have a chance to come in here and say a few words to you and bring you up to speed. I think I'll just start, first of all, because a lot of you haven't really met me. I mean, you probably haven't even heard me talk before. Maybe you were here 3 years ago when I was the priority candidate, and I spent a couple of trips around the campus, around the state. But more than likely, I probably haven't had a chance to see you in person. In fact, it was 3 years ago that then Regent Jim Pillen called me, and I had only interviewed for the job 2 weeks prior. And he called me and he said, "Ted, you're the priority candidate to be the next president of the University of Nebraska." And I said, "Jim, that's fantastic. What the hell is a priority candidate?" I didn't really get this whole confidential search thing. I know you probably didn't either. And my wife then said, "Where's Nebraska?" So, I mean, we were super excited about the potential to come here. I always knew a lot about Nebraska. I had a roommate when I was at the Naval Academy that went to Bellevue High School, was a pole vault champion in 1977. His name's Randy Durkoff. I listened incessantly to him about how great the Huskers were. And I know a lot of you lived through those years. You know, it was really an opportunity that I saw to be in higher education and come to a place that I always deeply respected. But it happened really fast. You know, as I was introduced, I served in uniform a long time. I had 3 chapters in my military career. The first was flying high-performance jet aircraft off to aircraft carriers. I did that almost every day for 20 years, all the way through squadron command. And at the end of my 20th year, finishing up a squadron command, I went to my second phase, which was to become a nuclear engineer and compete and eventually have the opportunity to command a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which I did do. That was 10 years in that part of the business. I made flag or 1-star admiral at the conclusion of that. That was in 2009. And I was a flag officer, a Navy admiral, for 10 years. That was more than a third of my career. It was a long time to be wearing stars on your shoulder. And I had a lot of really interesting jobs, not the least of which was to take the USS Enterprise, a 51-year-old aircraft carrier, on our last deployment 10 years ago. To this day, I was in the Atlantic dancing around Hurricane Sandy. I still remember it like yesterday. If you think an aircraft carrier that's as long as the Empire State Building is tall can't get tossed around in the open ocean, I'd never seen anything like it. we saw 60-foot waves that were on the outreaches of Hurricane Sandy. The waves were coming over the bow, hit the island structure that was more than 600 feet away from the bow. That's how big the waves were. We had to drive all the way down to Puerto Rico to try to stay out of that storm. And we pulled into Mayport, Florida, again, almost exactly 10 years ago when we brought that aircraft carrier home. That was my last operational time at sea. And I flew F-18 Super Hornets, just as you see in the movie Top Gun Maverick. I was 53 years old. I was still flying like I was 25. Those were some good days. And by the way, in your questions, if you want to know what's real and what's not real in the Top Gun Maverick movie, if you've seen it, I'm happy to give you those answers too. But then my career took that third chapter, and that's when I went into higher ed. I was asked to go lead the Naval War College. I was involved with changing some of the curriculum up there, went through a full accreditation for some of the programs that we were doing up there. We were doing some of the most intense wargaming we'd ever done during my time there. And even though I thought I would be there for 3 years, just like most of my life, the surprise came, and I was asked to go lead the U.S. Naval Academy, a place I had gone to school, a place where I had met my wife, who was at the University of Maryland. So she was thrilled to go back, but it also meant that that would be the end of my career. Title X law means that when you go become a superintendent, that you serve in that job for a minimum of 3 years. In my case, I was there for 5, and I retired in 2019. And we did a lot of things at the Naval Academy in 5 short years. And I know you're all understanding what it's like to be in senior administration and higher education. It's really hard to affect much change in just a couple of years. But we really pivoted a lot during those 5 years. The biggest thing I will tell you I was most proud of is we created the nation's first true cyber operations academic discipline, or major. We did that at the beginning of my time, and when I left, we were finished building a roughly $200 million academic building that now exists as really one of the centerpieces in the military service academies. It is the last modern-day academic building that will ever be built at the U.S. Naval Academy. The campus there is actually pretty small. It's only 350 acres. There's only 50 academic buildings there, and we shoehorned this one in right on the Severn River, and the whole building is filled with classified spaces and high-tech gear, and the midshipmen love it. They love it. It's one of the most popular academic majors, and now all the service academies are coming around to that, as is much of higher ed. So we were kind of a pioneer in that. So when I was finishing up my time at the Naval Academy, I actually wanted to stay in higher education. It was, I had a passion for it. My mother was an English teacher. I had her for high school English when I was in a small town in Burrillville, Rhode Island. My sister went on to education. My brother was in education. My grandmother was. And because I was a Top Gun instructor, I was in kind of the tactical military side of education all of my life, to include these last chapters. I'll be honest with you, I tried to apply to a lot of different places. I was interested in staying mostly on the East Coast. I got a lot of interviews, and I got everything but a yes. I won't take you through all the broken glass of interviewing there, but I'd all but given up. I'd already taken a high-tech job. I was going to go work in Washington, D.C. My wife and I bought the Forever House in Virginia, and we were on vacation in Jamaica, getting ready to go back to our Forever House, and I was about to start my first day in my new tech job on 1 October. And that was 3 years ago, 1 October. About 3 days prior to that is when the Nebraska Regents, as well as AGB Search, called me and said, hey, we want you to take a look at Nebraska. So they actually had to convince me. I'll be honest with you. I was about done with these searches. I didn't need another interview. And when I came out and did the interview, I mean, literally it was 2 weeks from my first interview to getting that call from Jim Pillen. So that's how quickly life can change. And oh, by the way, we still had the Forever House, and we had to go through our 24th move to come back out here. And of course, 2 months into my job here, boom, COVID. So, you know, how do you like me now? I mean, that's how this whole, 3-year journey started. So I'm not going to drag you through all of what's happened over the last 3 years, except to say, we've all been through some challenging times. And we had to make some big, big, hard decisions that really started happening around May of 2020. So this is about the time when we really understood how bad COVID was going to be. I got my first insight into it with Dr. Jeffrey Gold probably around late February of 2020. That's when we were already starting to talk about, there's going to come a point where we're going to be wearing masks, and just about everybody's going to get this. We anticipated the death rate to be about 1.5%. I mean, the numbers that we were talking about at the beginning of it were so unreal, it was hard to fathom. And it turned out that all of the early numbers that we heard from the Med Center turned out to be pretty accurate, even though there's still a lot we don't know about COVID-19 and some of the associated diseases that go with it. But what we did do during that period is we didn't let the situation drive us. We drove it to the level that we could. I knew that this type of problem would close campuses around the country, which it did. I knew that if we could not stay closed and get open as fast as possible, we would have a chance to hold our enrollment. I knew that if we had any chance to grow this state and grow its economy, it would happen through the university. So those are the type of strategic strokes that we were making in May of 2020. And that's how we came up with things like Nebraska Promise, freezing tuition for 2 years, for which we are still frozen. And we're one of the few schools in the country other than Purdue that have done that. We changed the cost of an online cost per credit hour to match in-person education. Do you know when I came here, it cost 10% more to take an online credit hour than it did in person? I had the same thought that you're having. Why? There's some technology things in there, and I said, that's not going to work. So we reduced that cost. We changed the academic calendar that first year of COVID to minimize travel for our students and for our faculty. We made a statement in June of 20 that we would be open, and we actually opened this campus that July and said for the fall of 2020 we would be open. Now, we didn't teach every class in person, but we taught 70% of them, a little bit less so at the Med Center and about the same at UNO, and almost all classes in person in Kearney. To give you a perspective on that, the rest of the Big Ten, the other 13 schools, and yes, there's still only 14 schools in the Big Ten. I know what's going on. They were about 30% in person and 70% outside of the classroom. That made a difference. A lot of folks don't know this. We actually grew enrollment at the height of the pandemic. We went from 51,000 students to 52,000 in the fall of 2020. And that was not only an increase in enrollment, that was against a 4% national enrollment drop. So when you put that in perspective, that's a pretty big swing. And I credit the faculty, I credit our friends at UNMC that helped us figure out how to de-densify the campuses, how to do testing when the vaccines came on, how to make sure the students knew they were available without trying to overly prescribe them. Again, we gave people a lot of choices for how to do things in a way that I thought was very fair. I got criticized by some people for how we did it. We had an app to get into buildings so that we know that you had been tested. People thought we were trying to intrude on people's private lives. Of course, none of that was true. And at the end of the day, we got through the worst of COVID. By the way, out of 51,000 plus students that we had on our 4 campuses, how many of you think had to go to the hospital for serious disease? Zero. Now, I can't say that for faculty and staff. We had a few people have some challenges. And yes, we did lose somebody that had other mitigating circumstances. But, at the end of the day, and I had notes to compare to my own service academy. I'm talking to the Naval Academy. I hadn't been there that long. They were going through machinations that they had never thought of before. Same thing at West Point out of Air Force Academy. They basically shut down. And they had a horrible time with it. So my point of telling you all that is we did well. And then we wrote the strategy for how we're going to operate the university over the next 5 years in the middle of that. So that was 2+ years ago, and now we just went and revisited that same strategy, and we've just updated it. So this is a great time to be together, because I can kind of give you the view of where we've been, what we've learned during this, and what we need to do. Because I will tell you this, and I know you all pay attention to the trends in higher ed. Higher ed was already going through changes. The pandemic just accelerated it. The cost of a higher education degree was out of control in this country, private schools in particular. The public post-secondary education system here in Nebraska is actually very good. With the exception of a couple of small privates, this state is one of the national leaders in high value for the education. So we already had that going for us. But then you go into this other rhetoric that's going on right now, and you can see this. Some of it's politics, some of it is just national trends, the cost of everything, inflation, changing in the minimum wage. There's been a discourse right now that maybe a post-secondary education isn't all that. And a four-year degree is even harder. Maybe it's not worth it. We wrote a strategy to try to get after that and help mitigate that. Obviously, I'm a big believer that post-secondary education is not only something that's good to have, I think it's going to be absolutely necessary. And I'll just give you one very simple statistic. If you look at the trends in jobs today, the job market has changed dramatically if you look back just 10, 15, 25 years ago. Well, if you try to fast forward and think about what the job market's going to look like 10 years from now, most of those jobs haven't been invented yet. Think about that for a second. So degrees in computer science, data engineering, data management, these are disciplines that we didn't even have on campuses just a few years ago. And now every campus has them, and they're going to be the hinge pin to a technical degree. And yet we still have to have a strong belief in the humanities, because we still have to be able to read and write and speak. But the job market's going to change dramatically. Now, that doesn't mean that we still don't need plumbers and electricians and construction workers. Absolutely. And I'm a huge advocate for community college and tech degrees, vocational schools. I think in a state like Nebraska, there's enough room for all of it. But yet, if I were to take what we in the Navy call a running navigational fix, where are we today? Our enrollment's down. We're down 2.2% from just a year ago. And we went down a little bit after 20 going into 21. So for the first time in a few years, we're below 50,000 students total across the state, less than 25,000 here at UNL. So if you were to do a little analytics on that, I would tell you that the majority of those drops are in graduate studies and international students. No surprise there, the pandemic almost decimated our international student, particularly in person. The only people that were here were the ones that were here before that. And now we have a lot of international students who want to come back here. They can't get visas. So that's what's holding us up right now on a lot of enrollment. And quite frankly, the number of Nebraskans coming to our university has dropped off a little bit. And I wish I could give you the exact answer why that is. I have some theories. We're going to have to work on that. And maybe you can help me with that, because at the end of this talk, every one of you are going to be an ambassador for the university, and I want you to be able to go out and tell the stories about what you heard here today. And I'm sure we can continue with some dialogue about some things that you're interested in. So before I get to questions, let me just tell you what are the five things that I think are the most important as we've rewickered our strategy. Number one, and this is by far number one. Everything else is a lower secondary, those other four compared to number one. Students are number one. Gone is the day that anybody in higher ed should think of the student as a product. And higher ed used to do that. Let's face it, higher ed has never been known for being dynamic and quickly shifting and making quick turns based on the environment. If you're really good at teaching and you're a top-end institution, the students just come to you. Schools like Harvard and Stanford and MIT, they don't have to put TV commercials out to advertise for who they are. And I think here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, we've had that reputation within the state. Now, I can't speak to that competently because I'm a newcomer relatively, but I've been all over the state and I've talked to a lot of people, and I know how Nebraskans view UNL, and you are quite arguably the people that built the reputation of this institution, which is quite honestly fantastic. But you just can't sit on your laurels. So what did you do for me today? So students are no longer the product, they're the customer. Students get to make a choice. Attend college, not attend college, go to community college, go to a state college, go to MIT because I got a top-end score on my ACT and I'm top 5 in my class. And we also have to think about who do we want to come to our university. The demographics of the state of Nebraska are changing, not as quickly as the rest of the country, but it is changing. And we're seeing that in who's now wanting to come to university. We are the most ethnically diverse we've ever been, And that has changed every year that I've been here, and we've done nothing to try to make that happen. That's just who's in the population. So we've got to make affordability and accessibility job number one for us. And that was the impetus behind creating Nebraska Promise, free tuition for Nebraskans who today make $65,000 or less. Now, I already know the criticism. Why are you giving away tuition just because somebody doesn't make a lot of money? Well, the truth is it's not free because that's not cost of attendance. And cost of attendance now is really the name of the game. In fact, scholarships that just offer free tuition are not working that well anymore. And what has changed dramatically from when you taught here, when cost of attendance was about equal tuition to living on campus, getting food, parking, books, fees, healthcare. Today, that's about 2/3 of the cost, and the tuition's about 1/3. That's cost of inflation. That's cost of, supply chain. Everything else is going up. So we've got to be smart about thinking about what affordability and accessibility really means in today's environment. And that's some work still to be done. There's also a population of adult out there in Nebraska that have some partial college credit. And a lot of them would like to finish a degree somewhere. This might surprise you. We're about 1.9 million people here in the state of Nebraska. 307,000 working adults in Nebraska have some partial credit in their portfolio. Some have 2 years, a year, 3 years. We don't want to lose out on that population. What we learned during the pandemic was how to teach remotely, what's now being called hybrid, some partial in person, some through a Zoom or computer screen, synchronous versus asynchronous. We can do all that now. So we need to make sure that we're making all the tools, the affordability, and how to get to us as easy as we can. So that's job number one. And as I said, we still have some work to do. The second is competition for talent. And the competition for talent is how do I get the top 20% of those 25,000 high school graduates a year coming out of the state of Nebraska to decide, and if 11,000 or 12,000 of them are college bound, which is about historically the numbers, how do I get them to decide on University of Nebraska versus going somewhere else? And that's going to take some more work. And it's going to take footwork. It's going to take us getting into high schools and talking to guidance counselors. It's stuff that we haven't done as well as I think in the past, and the pandemic really hurt us. And on top of that, the real competition for talent is how do we keep those kids in the state of Nebraska? So you've read about brain drain. That was a big topic when I came here. It turns out that we're actually starting to turn that around a little bit. About 75% of our graduates at UNL are actually staying in state. A little over 50% of the out-of-state students are deciding to stay in the state. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's too awful. We can do better. By the way, when we looked at students that are in financial need, no matter what the program is, Pell Grant, Nebraska Promise, a program that had been called College Bound Nebraska, those students tend by more than 80% to stay in the state. So when I went to the governor and I went to other members of the legislature, by the way, we ate the cost of that internally. We never put that on the backs of the taxpayers. I cut the budget $50 million at the height of COVID to manage some of the programs that we needed to do and also anticipate some of the programs that we knew would be hit. So we cut our budget $50 million over 3 years and did not lose a single academic program. It was all administration. We've got to figure out how to do that and how to keep those students here and move them into the workforce. So this year, we're requiring every student in the system, regardless of what campus they go to have a meaningful internship somewhere in the state. And this is really hard because some businesses can do paid internships and some can't, especially the medium and small size ones. So we got the state to appropriate $30 million to put out some money for small and medium-sized businesses to borrow that money so they could pay students for internships. And then you have to create a mechanism to connect the student with the Kiewit or the Samson or you name whatever company you want them to go work for. So we have an electronic platform. It's called Handshake, and I call it eHarmony for Work. And it's basically letting students know what's out there. And it's really growing fast. So we're starting to make some progress there. And the idea there is to let students that are in the sophomore and junior year know what's out there before they're trying to figure out whether or not they want to stay in the state. You know, what I have found here is a lot of young men and women that decide to go move to Kansas City or Denver or somewhere nearby because they're going to get $10,000 more in a salary. And then they find out that that's worse than the cost of living index because it costs so much more to live there. And then they come back, the boomerang. So we want to prevent the boomerang and just make them stay here and find a way, show them how good it is to stay here. So again, students, affordability and accessibility, number one. Going after talent is number two. Taking care of our people is number three. When I got here, the faculty at UNL were 4% lower than their peers in the Big Ten for pay. And there was no chance of fixing that. The budget was tight. I couldn't raise tuition any more than it was already up. And then the pandemic hit. So to be quite frank, and coming from a military background, I didn't want to let a crisis go to waste. And that's where we said, you know what, we're going to have to cut our budget. Let's cut the budget another $10 million and pay for faculty salaries out of that. So we did that. Again, we didn't put it on the backs of the taxpayers. We cut it internally. So we fixed faculty salary at UNL and UNMC to match their peers. First time they had been matched ever since being in the Big Ten. We did a lot of other programs to kind of make sure that people felt like they really wanted to be here. And that's really important because, you know, the competition for talent in any profession right now is tough. And a lot of schools are letting people go teach remotely wherever they want to live. And we're fighting that right now. What's the future work going to really look like? And we're having a real deep conversation about that. I am personally a big fan of come to work. Don't work from home. But, you know, I'm old and I think a little differently, and I have a feeling a lot of you would agree with me that that's the way to go. But not everybody sees it that way. But taking care of our people is definitely a top priority. Taking care of our stuff. You know how many buildings we have. I mean, this is a beautiful student union. This has been all fixed up here on the East Campus. You may or may not know this, but the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has 600 buildings. 600 buildings. I came from a campus that had 50. We own almost 1,000 across the system, and in fact, we own 72% of the state-owned buildings in the state of Nebraska, the University of Nebraska. So we are by far the majority building owner, and guess what? Most of those buildings were built when you were teaching. So I'm not going to make a comment about age, but these buildings are aging, and you've got two choices when you have an aging building. You can fix it or you can knock it down and start over again. And that's costly. So the replacement value of our roughly 900 academic buildings, so I'm not including dorms or athletic facilities, is somewhere north of $10 billion. Now your argument would be, well, if you're doing a lot of remote teaching, do you need all those academic buildings? And the answer is yes. I want us to be poised for growth. I'm going to be realistic here and say we might not get to 60,000 total students. We may not go from today 23,500 students on the UNL campus to 30,000. You know, Harvey Perlman was talking about that a few years ago. I just want us to get back to 25 to 26,000. And I want students, when they come to our campus to make a decision about coming here, to see the quality buildings that we can have. So we did this at the height of the pandemic. I worked with Senator John Stinner from Gering. He was the head of the Appropriations Committee, Chris Kaborik, the team here at UNL, and we came up with a plan. And some of this is scar tissue that I lived at the Naval Academy. So those 50 buildings that I own there, 40 of them are over 100 years old. So they're historic buildings. And many of them were really, really tough to maintain. We were arguably $250 million in the rear in trying to take care of those buildings, and we weren't getting the money. How much money do you think UNL, UNMC, UNO, and UNK are behind in just taking care of the buildings? I'm not talking about putting new buildings up. I'm just talking about the price tag to get them up to code and up to speed. $800 million. $800 million. That's what it was when I got here. So we had to come up with a plan to do that without breaking the bank. So historically, the state would give us a certain amount of money for repairs and for longer range maintenance, and it would go in pockets of about 10 years. And every 10 years, we'd renegotiate with the state, get just enough money. I mean, it's a total whack-a-mole game. And meanwhile, the total price tag of the repairs was going up. So we weren't getting after this at all. So we said, we got to come up with a different plan. So we did. So instead of getting about $11 million a year from the state, which we would match out of our budget, we upped that to $13.5 million. Not a huge amount, not a big difference, but still, $2.5 million more a year. University matches it. We put a 2% depreciation on every dollar we put into that maintenance plan, meaning it's kind of like a 401k investment plan. And we started that in 2021. And we're going to do that for 40 years. So at the end of 40 years, that 2% depreciation will grow enough to a big enough account that the state will be relieved of ever putting a penny into our building restoration plan. And we took out a $400 million bond at the lowest interest rates in U.S. government history. Good timing. So we're going to be out of that $800 million backlog on things like HVACs, windows, roofs, other major installments and programmatics in 10 years. And we have a plan, and it's going to work. And I'm really excited about it. We haven't talked enough about that. This isn't the sexiest thing in the world. Not everybody's all that interested in this. This will have such an investment. And if we had stayed on the course in the way the history of the state of Nebraska had done this, we would have spent $1.5 billion more on the way we had been doing business as opposed to this new plan. And that's real cost savings to the taxpayers. And the whole thing when it's total will cost a little over $1 billion to do. So again, these are big, big numbers. There's $1 billion of maintenance and building facility going on the Lincoln campus right now, over $1 billion. So we're in a position of sustaining ourselves and now looking to a position of the future of going into growth. And a lot of that is also on the backs of philanthropy. And I'll talk about philanthropy later if somebody has a question about it. The last thing is I want us to be accountable. I wore the uniform for 38 years. I was pretty used to being held accountable for just about everything I did. I came here, and even though we're a public university and everything we do is supposed to be open to the public, I found that we didn't do as good a job as we could. So if you ever go on our website, particularly the system website, you will find every detail you'd ever want to know about our budget, every detail about what goes into those Board of Regents meetings. We are going to be as open and transparent as we can, and in the meanwhile, we're reviewing ourselves. We are grading ourselves, and we are metricizing every single thing that's important. And when I want to measure something, I want to measure something such that if I am below the mark, it causes me or my team to make a change in behavior to get to that next mark. So I'm not measuring activity, I am measuring outcomes. And we're going to be hard on ourselves, and we're not perfect. I can guarantee you we've made some mistakes going into even where we are now, and we'll admit them when we have them. But at the end of the day, the University of Nebraska is going to be relevant. It's going to be a leader in the things that we know that we can be the best at. Agriculture, teaching, supporting the Department of Defense. We do a tremendous amount of work for the Department of Defense. Medicine, rural prosperity. We're doing some things right now with the state that is actually going to go after rural health care. We're one of the first states in the country to actually do something to try to get after and improve creating the right amount of doctors, nurses, mental health professionals that can actually get back out into rural Nebraska. And that's some of the effort we're doing out with UNMC and UNK. So those are the 5 things that we're really working on that we're going to care about and that we're going to measure ourselves against. So let me stop, see what's on your mind. Any question is good today, I'll come to you, or maybe Linda's going to walk around with a microphone. And we've got a few minutes here, so I try to make it so that we had at least only half an hour me talking and half an hour you talking. Yes, sir.
Going back to your comment about students as consumers or whatever, how do you balance that, their opinion, with what they need to know whether they like it or not? I guess that's the way of putting it.
This is the age-old question. Now, when I say we treat the students as customers rather than a product, I didn't necessarily get into curriculum or curriculum management. So I have a much more interesting meeting this afternoon with the Faculty Senate right after this, and we're going to talk about some of those things. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've been in academia, I've been in the classroom, I've done some things. My role as your university system president is not necessarily to drive the curriculum. I'll do the broader strokes. I'm an empowerment type of leader. I believe in giving the chancellors, the provosts, the deans, the right material, the right facilities, the right resources to do their job. We'll take a look at where the trends are, but in terms of what gets spoken of in the classroom or what the curriculum development is, I think that's a little bit maybe where you're going. I'll be involved in that. Of course, we have to do that with the regents too, but the regents don't drive academic curriculum either. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to make sure that our students get the basics right. If you have a university degree, you ought to be able to read, write, you ought to be able to be a problem solver, you ought to be able to be a critical thinker, you ought to be able to think for yourself. So we do need to do a review of that every once in a while, and I would tell you that there's probably more of that going on now than we have been doing in a while. And what we're finding is, there's a supply and demand part to this thing. We cut an academic discipline out in Kearney, philosophy major. Some of you might have read about that in the paper. My goodness, there were 2 people in the curriculum over 3 years, 2 kids. We had 4 people teaching it. It was time to consolidate that. And by the way, nobody lost their job. Nobody was kicked out of a program. They were all grandfathered. But it's really hard to take an academic discipline away, and yet we're constantly adding them. And if you're following the trends in higher ed, most students don't want to come in and be just a systems engineer. They want something a la carte. Yeah, I want the engineering degree, but I also want a little bit of business major, and I'd like to minor in French. And you got to be able to have all that, and you got to be able to do that. So that's something that's being discussed a lot right now. The title of your degree may not actually be relevant to what you studied in your academic disciplines, because students want to be so much more diversified.
You mentioned that you go to an old-fashioned thinking here, come into the office to work thinking.
Yeah.
And I would like to challenge you to look at the benefits to the work from home faculty members, because there's a lot of benefits that take place. And I'm not up on the whole thing, just a smattering of it here and there. But I would like to say I think that is a change in thinking that is very important.
No, it's a good comment, and I didn't want to give you the impression that it was my way or the highway on this. I'm pretty open-minded, and I am listening to the discussion. And there are quite a few jobs, besides faculty, that really do work well in a work-from-home situation. So IT is a good example. So some of you may be aware, the Office of the President, or what used to be called the University of Nebraska Central Administration, I kind of took that title away because I try to decentralize things as much as we can to give them back to the campuses. But one of the things that we are truly centralized on is information technology. Now, that workforce does not really need to have an office. They can do most of that work remotely from home. There are a few other things that would work pretty well with that. And there are certainly some faculty that want to work remotely. And for those that either teach remotely or offer classes remotely, we'll have some spots for that. But I also know that the best environment for which most people want to learn is in person amongst a group of students where they can hear other ideas, other thoughts. So I still think that's a very relevant model. It doesn't mean that that's the only pedagogy that we're going to have in how we teach. So there will be, and there are teachers that are teaching only remotely today. And I get why people want to do that. You don't have to travel. You may have kids at home. You may be able to manage that as well. It doesn't cost much for dry cleaning bills and all that. So yes, it is a much cheaper way to do the same job, and some people have gotten very, very good at that. And there are tools now that make that even more relevant than it was in the past. So yeah, we're working through that. We're having that conversation here at UNL and other campuses. It is interesting, campus to campus, there's different cultures. UNK, there's almost nobody there that's interested in doing that. Here at UNL, there are quite a few more. And might not surprise you, we have more than 50 faculty that teach here at UNL that don't even live in the state of Nebraska, live somewhere else and do that job. So we're having to go through all the statutes, and a lot of those people moved out of here during the pandemic, and there's tax laws, and it gets complicated. Healthcare, all that. So we're having to work through all those details right now, and I'll just say it's complicated. It's not a one-size-fits-all for everybody. So yeah, it's a good conversation to have right now. Yes, sir. I'll go here first.
I was told once to ask you a question like this. We're a land-grant college. A vast amount of our wealth to be created and still comes from what we did with indigenous lands. I, for one, would like to see a day when any Native American could come here free. And I think you've thought about this some.
This is also a great comment, and in fact, Chancellor Ronnie Green and I just had this conversation about 2 weeks ago. We're working through how we can make our land more attractive to Native American Indians, as well as the educational aspect of it. But you're exactly right. I mean, this university is rooted in being a land-grant university, and that is based on affordability and accessibility. That's why that's job number one. Oh, by the way, military science was part of that too, which draws me right in. I think that's fantastic. We have a historic ROTC program here, but we don't want to ever lose the roots of who we are as a land-grant university. It is the very personality of who we are. So we've got to always keep that out front. Things like extension, research out in the Panhandle. We're living through the worst drought we've seen since 2002, maybe one of the worst we've ever had, and likely probably going to have 30 inches of snow this winter. So we may go into more of a flooding type situation next year. These weather extremes, we've got to be able to navigate ourselves through. And where you've got 90% of the land mass here being used as farmland or for ranchers, we got to figure out how do we sustain ourselves in that situation. And what I've come to know here in Nebraska is a true microcosm of the entire country. All of the agri-zones of the entire United States are all in this one state. It's actually quite cool. And I've been around the state now enough to see all of the different temperatures and climates and soil. It's a fascinating place, and we still have so much more to learn. And oh, by the way, we live on the greatest and biggest aquifer in North America, which also makes us pretty unique here as well. And yet, you go out to the Panhandle, and they'll tell you it's the driest they've ever seen in history out there. And we got to figure out how to sustain ourselves in that. So that's part of the university's job, is to help in that type of research and understand that. Okay, back here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, President Carter, Chuck Hibbard.
Hey, Chuck. Yeah, good to see
So
you.
3 years ago, we flew to Scotts Bluff
Yeah.
during Ted's priority candidate phase. And I can tell everybody in the room, when you're flying in an airplane, it's good to have a spare pilot back in the back, right? So thank you for that. It was a great experience. So Nebraska Community Foundation has studied high school students for the last 3 years. Over 3,000 students participated. 82% want to stay in Nebraska. 82% want to live either in their hometown or someplace close to their hometown.
Yeah.
So I have really two questions. One, how is the university engaging and listening to employers and communities across the state to help make sure that our educational programs meet their needs, what they would like to achieve? And then flip that, I'm also curious about how is the university engaging employers and communities across this state to help them be more attractive for our students, so the handshake is really, really tight.
Yeah, great question, Chuck. The first thing is, I call this an all-hands-on-deck effort. So if you go back to some of my earlier comments, the reputation and the culture of who we are, we just kind of always expected these young people to come to us. And you're right about, that's true nationwide, by the way. Most young people don't want to leave their hometowns. In fact, this generation, and I'm talking about the generation that was born not affected by 9/11, generationally don't want to live overseas. They don't want to serve in the military as much, interestingly. And we're seeing that trend right now. They want to stay closer to home, and Nebraska is part of that, maybe more so than even other states. So we should be trying to take advantage of that. Now, if you take a look at the population trend in grade school going through high school here over the next few years, Nebraska is going to be delayed from what the nation's calling this huge drop-off. So in 2025, the population of high school seniors graduating is going to take like a 5% drop. And that's a pretty significant drop. Nebraska is going to see a smaller drop, and it's not going to be until 2027. So we have a little bit of an advantage that our high school graduating seniors are still a pretty good population, about 25,000, I said before. And if we can get 20,000 of them to look at serious post-secondary education, we will have made a dent. Now, you may know that the legislature put out a resolution wanting by the year 2030 to have 70% of the age group from 25 to 34 be post-secondary certificate or degree holding people. 70%. That's pretty significant. So there's a statement, there's a target out there, Chuck, that we're going for. We're at 54% today. That's a big leap. The university will do its part, because we're already taking 11,000 of those students, and we're graduating at a high rate here at UNL, and we're improving at the other places. But we've got to get into 4th and 5th grade, not 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, to start planning these ideas about what's in the art of possible at our university system, our state college, and the community college. And some of these young people don't want to go to four-year university. I mean, if you're growing up in I said Gering before, but I'll use Gering again. Coming to a campus like UNL is like going to the big city. That's not attractive to everybody. They might be interested in Kearney. They might actually be interested in Western Nebraska Community College. I'm fine with all of that, quite honestly, as long as they pick something. I also want to make sure that we have now what a lot of the businesses are saying that they need. So not everybody needs to see a 4-year degree to go to work. They might need a certificate in IT, 6 credit hours in Microsoft programming, and they can go to work, and then they can continue to go to school. So we're starting to take a look at what we can do in things beyond just a 4-year undergraduate degree, master's degree, PhD, the classic type of programs. So that's part of the answer to that. The second part is making sure we understand what the business community tells us they need. So a great example of that is, we've got some of the best construction and engineering programs in this state in the country. And I'm amazed when I go talk to them, I say, what percentage of your workforce comes from UNL or UNO? It's not that high. They're getting them from other places. So we've got to create more engineers for those guys to be attracted in us, and we're doing that. So we're building out Kiewit Hall. We're going to double the number of engineers we're going to have here. We're already doubling the number of computer science majors we're going to have. And that's going to be an opportunity for growth, but that's also going to be a shift in what the employers are telling us that the future employee needs to be. And those are attractive programs. And by the way, the next model for scholarship is going to be, a lot of these companies will pay for some number of students. We've got 10 Kiewit scholars right now, going to 40, where they not only pay for their tuition, they pay for their room and board, they pay for their internships, and they guarantee a job. That's a service academy model. And that's going to start looking more and more attractive, because not only are young people thinking that they want their degree, they want a guaranteed life after that. So we need to be exploring that a little bit more to see what that future opportunity is. And that can work in other business, manufacturing, tech. Yes, sir.
Just to learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah.
What aspect or experience in your naval career, other than leading the academy, has prepared you the best to lead a higher institution?
Yeah, it's a very good and fair question. Believe it or not, leading the Naval Academy is not what made me prepare to do this job. I don't know that I would have known that when I was interviewing for it. What I did have the opportunity to do in uniform was lead very large, complex organizations with many, many different facets of people that work for me. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you two examples of two jobs that I had. First was my aircraft carrier command. It was not driving a ship all over the world. It was a complete reconstruction of an existing aircraft carrier to bring it back to its original life. So the USS Carl Vinson at 25 years old, I was in command. I took it into the shipyard, drove it into a giant bathtub, landed it on 1,200 7-foot tall blocks within a centimeter, drained the bathtub, and it sat in that empty bathtub for a year. We took out all the nuclear fuel rods, replaced them, took all the cabling off, replaced all 4 catapults, all 4 resting gear engines, redid every space, all the kitchens, the medical center. It was a $2 billion level of effort. I had 11,000 shipyard workers to work with, plus my crew of 3,000. And I did all that in 3 years. I was only the 3rd in the history to run a program like that. The first 2 were horrific disasters. $1 billion over budget and delivered a year late. We delivered that ship on time and on budget. Here's an interesting footnote to that story. So 2 months before delivery, I got all the admirals on board. I mean, I'm like a proud father. I'm showing off the shiny new penny. We're walking through the medical spaces. And the medical spaces are, you know, a place of pride. And believe it or not, you have to have a medical facility big enough to handle a 600-person mass casualty. So if you have a mass casualty on the flight deck, you'll be able to take care of 600 injured sailors. So we're showing all this off. My senior medical officer was a Navy commander, and the 4-star admiral's with me. We're almost done. And he says, Admiral, you know, if we had $1 million more, we could make this operating room dual purpose as a state-of-the-art morgue. And I'm looking at this commander, I'm like, are you kidding me? We're almost done here. We're going to deliver this ship under budget, and you're talking to the Admiral about delivering a first-class morgue. And the Admiral looked at me, and I said, sir, this is Dr. Chris Lucas. He's a Harvard grad. He's really smart. He's one of the best in the Navy. So he explains, you know, we lose a sailor or 2 every year we go to sea, and they come from all different denominations, more so now than ever, and we don't have the ability to do some of those things correctly. So the Admiral looked at me and he said, do you think you can put that together in 2 months? And I said, yes, sir. I put total faith in my doctor, who just totally shocked me. And I said, yeah, we'll do, and we did. So we delivered that ship in 2009. The Carl Vinson went on deployment into Haiti, if you remember that big storm they had down there in 2010. And then she went on a really significant deployment in 2011. On May 3rd, 2011, the world's worst terrorist was taken out by SEAL Team 6. And guess where they buried him from? The USS Carl Vinson, because we had that morgue. He was buried without anybody on that ship knowing he was there, only SEAL Team 6, the captain, the admiral, and the senior medical officer, Chris Lucas. And they buried him from aircraft elevator number 4 at sunrise on May 3rd in an undisclosed location in the North Arabian Sea, never to be found again. That was a lesson in believing in your people, and something that proved that we never imagined would happen 2 years later. So that's my experience in leading one large complex organization. I'll tell you another one. In 2010, I was a 1-star admiral working at U.S. Joint Forces Command, one of 10 combatant commands, similar to the U.S. Strategic Command. I was in Norfolk, Virginia. Secretary of Defense Bob Gates came on national television, said, we're running out of money. I'm going to shut down U.S. Joint Forces Command. Shut it down. Jim Mattis, General Jim Mattis, was the 4-star in charge at the time. General Ray Odierno, Army, was coming in to take command. Mattis leaves on Friday. Odierno takes over on Saturday, calls me and says, I've never met you. I'm in Iraq. I'm shutting down that operation. You have 4 months to get this deal done. Keep me informed. 6,600 people, all different walks of life, government, civilians, active duty, reservists, 25 commands in this joint command all over the country, and we had to shut it down in 8 months. And I was in charge of that. I learned more about joint operations, healthcare benefits, civilian workforce, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life, and managing that in 8 months was a life lesson in dealing with people and jobs, job security, missions, understanding mission, and we got it done. We actually did shut down Joint Forces Command in August of 2011. The job that I had that makes the most comparison to this job was my last job at sea. So I was an admiral in charge of a whole system, 50 ships, the system. I lived on an aircraft carrier, the flagship, but yet I had nothing in charge of the flagship. And I had to give commander's intent to all of those 50 ships every day without running any of them. I made sure they were trained, they had the right resources, and they knew their job and could execute. That is the most similar to what I do every day. I'm a CEO. I manage a $3 billion enterprise where 1 in 27 people in the state of Nebraska work for me. That's today. We have an economic impact to this state today of $5.8 billion. We return our roughly $630 million of taxpayer money to the tune of 9-to-1 return on investment, and that's the type of economic impact we have on the state. We have to be accountable and transparent enough to be able to continue to do that job, do the mission of educating the youth of this state and outside the state and international, stay true to our land-grant university mission, stay true to the academic disciplines that we are good at, and help drive and grow this state. I said this when I came here, and I believe it now more than I ever have, that the state of Nebraska will only go as well as the University of Nebraska system goes. Now, I get that ag and ranching are number one here. You know, $1 in $4 in the entire state comes from that business. But we're not far back from it, and we have an impact on that business too. So yeah, I don't have the classic, I was never a dean or a provost or those other things, but what I have found is for the way this job in the state has the university president job set up, I was actually better suited for it than I thought. And you know what? I love what I do. I hope you got that from me today. I love being here. I love being here with all of you. I love the people of this state. They are genuine, they're authentic, they're not scared, and they expect people to make decisions, not on full information, but on enough information to make a decision. I've lived in a lot of states in the country. I've lived in all 4 corners. It's the first time I ever lived in the middle. I love that type of attitude. This is a great place to be. Okay, I've got time for 1, maybe 2 more.
So you said no question was off limits?
Nope, there's none. I consider this Chatham House rules though, too.
Okay. So do you have any advice for Ben Sass?
Do I? Yeah.
Here's maybe an easier question.
Yeah.
This deal that was in the Examiner about these regents races
Yeah.
being possibly bankrolled to get rid of you and the chancellor.
Yeah.
You can respond to either question or just say,
I'll give you
she
an
needs to
answer
go
both.
away.
No. So I met Ben Sass right after I took the job. He and I went to his hometown of Fremont. We spent 4 hours in a coffee shop. I really was curious to know him and learn about all he had done at Midlands, which I had studied and was pretty impressed with the exception of getting rid of tenure. And we had a great talk. And there's no doubt that Ben is a brilliant, brilliant man. He's got all the academic chops. And he told me, even then, that he was very interested in this job or one like it somewhere. So it wasn't a surprise to me that all of a sudden he was announced as the University of Florida prospective or priority candidate. So I texted him as soon as the announcement came out. I congratulated him and I said, I wish you all the best. I look forward to you being one of our academic colleagues. And he responded back right away, thanks for the thoughtful note. And then I watched as he went off to Florida and had a really nice welcoming And I haven't said anything back, but if I were going to send something to him right now, what I would say to him is, it's hard, and you can never, ever separate whatever you've done in your previous life from the next life you're going to go do. And he's learning that right now. You know, and I don't. So I go back on what I did in uniform, and I have no problem translating that to what I do now. By the way, when I was in uniform, I was apolitical. I never registered for one party or the other. I'm still a registered independent today in the state of Nebraska, which could imagine has some challenges. And I live as true to that as I can. I will admit that this job is political because I have to deal with politically elected regents, politically elected legislature, politically elected governor. And I will tell you, when I meet with these people, and I don't care whether I'm talking to Steve Erdman, Mike Groney, or Patty Pansing Brooks, I always find that if I can get to any piece of common ground with them, two things that we both care about, the conversation goes fine after that. Not going to always agree, and that's going to be true. And Governor Pete Ricketts and I have had many times we don't disagree, but you know what we do have? We have the ability to talk to each other. And I find that to be the most valuable. So yes, there's some pretty interesting regents races coming up, and it's something that is constant work. My relationship with the regents is they own my contract, they own my employment, but yet I don't work directly for them. I work with them, and they work with me, and they work with the chancellors, and that's the relationship we have to have. When anybody's running for regent, I tell them that if you care about the betterment of the university, then you're in the job for the right reason. And that's all that matters. Now, there's going to be different personalities. There are different personalities in the Board of Regents today. We've been through some hard stuff already, and there'll be more hard stuff in the future. Much of it will be budget-based, and that'll be some of our biggest challenges as we're dealing with inflation, recession, and all the rest. So yeah, it's going to get pretty interesting, no doubt about it. All right, thank you all very much.
President Carter. Well, President Carter, I want to let you know that in lieu of a speaker's gift, we present an honorarium of a $100 check to the ERA Scholarship Fund in your name.